An astonishing 719 sexual assault lawsuits have been filed against the Department of Correction. She was abused multiple times in the 33 days that she spent at Rikers on a DUI charge. We do want to warn you, some of you may find the details of this case graphic.
Imagine stepping into a cell where your safety hangs on a single checkbox. One wrong tick and your nightmare begins. Inside America's prisons, female inmates are being mistakenly, or sometimes deliberately, placed in male cells.
I was asleep. When I woken up, he was having sex with me. I was trying to fight back.
What follows isn't just fear, but assault, trauma, and silence.
It's the hardest thing. It's hard.
These aren't random errors. They're cracks in a system that's shielded by a wall of secrecy. And the most vulnerable, especially transgender inmates, pay the price.
Was kicked in my chest, my head rammed to the wall, and then I slammed to the floor.
Number 8. DC Jail Incident. Some nightmares don't start with screams. Sometimes they start with a paperwork error. On February 3, 2021, a 24-year-old woman walked into the DC jail expecting the usual, well, as usual as jail can be. She had just faced a judge via teleconference over a misdemeanor assault charge and was ordered to be released on personal recognizance. This should have been routine, process, paperwork, and out the door. Instead, a single operational error turned that hour into something she'll remember for the rest of her life. Somewhere between the court order and the release desk, her paperwork, or rather, someone handling it, went wrong. Instead of being processed for release, she was taken to the central cell block, a holding area meant for male inmates only. Inside, she was surrounded by men she didn't know, in a space she shouldn't have been in at all. One man performed a sex act in front of her, brazen, threatening, and humiliating. She couldn't leave. She couldn't even look away. It lasted only an hour, but an hour can be an eternity when fear does the counting. When the mistake came to light, the DC Department of Corrections moved fast, but mostly to cover the paperwork, not the wound. They acknowledged the error. They called it an operational mistake and then issued an apology. But here's the thing, apologies don't undo trauma. They don't erase what she saw. They don't change the fact that the facility broke its own policy, one meant to prevent exactly this kind of scenario. No staff member was publicly disciplined. No one lost their job. On the record, it was a serious lapse. Off the record, it was just another day at the office. Her family didn't stay quiet. This cannot happen to another woman, a relative told local media. They pushed for answers, accountability, something tangible. Behind the scenes, the young woman was struggling. Reports indicated she began receiving treatment for PTSD in the months that followed. A single hour in the wrong cell had fractured her sense of safety in ways that would take years to rebuild. They explored legal action, and by late 2021, a lawsuit was filed. It didn't turn into a media storm, but it did get noticed. The case was quietly settled in 2023, with terms kept confidential. The facility didn't have to admit wrongdoing. She didn't have to relive the moment in court. But the silence of settlements often speaks volumes. What's striking about this case isn't just what happened, but what didn't. There was no physical assault, no headline-grabbing scandal, and yet the psychological damage was real and deep. The Dowsey apologized, yes, but apologies aren't accountability. And their fix, they updated intake procedures and introduced new training modules for officers. On paper, that's progress, but in practice, it's like patching a leaky roof after the storm already soaked the floor. This gap between institutional response and personal trauma is what makes cases like this both infuriating and unforgettable. This case ended without violence, one advocate said, but that doesn't make it safe. It makes it silent, and if this was what an error looked like, imagine what happens when the system is just careless. Number 7. Illinois case. Logan Correctional Center. Prisons are supposed to be places of control and order, but sometimes what happens behind those walls is far more chaotic than anyone on the outside imagines. That's exactly what the Logan Correctional Center case exposed. A collision between policy, identity, fear, and a system that wasn't ready for the storm. The story begins with Janiyah Monroe, born Andre Patterson, a transgender woman whose name would become a flashpoint in the national debate over how to house transgender inmates. Monroe wasn't a newcomer to the system. She'd been incarcerated since 2005, serving a long sentence for multiple violent felonies, including second-degree murder, attempted murder, and aggravated battery. While in male prisons, she endured years of sexual abuse and harassment. There were suicide attempts, self-harm incidents, and documented PTSD. Her lawyers argued she wasn't just unsafe in male facilities. she was being destroyed by them. In 2019, after years of legal battles, Monroe's attorneys from the Uptown People's Law Center and the MacArthur Justice Center finally pushed for her transfer to a women's facility. And it worked. On April 1st, 2019, Monroe walked into Logan Correctional Center, a women's prison in Illinois. The decision was historic. Advocates celebrated it as a win for transgender rights and inmate safety. But inside Logan, not everyone felt safe. Monroe's history wasn't a secret. Other inmates had heard about her past. Guards had too. Some female inmates feared her presence, citing her violent record. And then, just 2 months after her transfer, everything exploded. A female inmate, identified only as Jane Doe in court filings, filed a lawsuit in early 2020, alleging that Monroe raped her on June 18, 2019. According to Doe, Monroe arrived in her housing unit that day, expressed interest in her almost immediately, and later overpowered and assaulted her. Doe claimed she was terrified. Monroe was bigger, stronger, and had a dangerous history. But here's where things got darker. Doe alleged that after the assault, Internal Affairs interviewed her. The next day, a senior officer reportedly pressured her to retract the accusation, insisting the encounter was consensual. She said she felt coerced, cornered, and ultimately punished for filing what the prison later labeled a false complaint under the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Her punishment? Segregation and loss of privileges, while Monroe remained in Logan. It wasn't just Doe. According to testimony from Logan's head psychiatrist, multiple inmates reported sexual misconduct involving Monroe. Some allegations were deemed false, others were buried in red tape. Logan's former warden described Monroe's time at the facility as turbulent, a string of disciplinary tickets, threats, and PREA complaints that made her a lightning rod for controversy. Meanwhile, Monroe's lawyers maintained that she was being targeted because she was transgender. They argued that the IDOC had investigated the Doe incident and concluded the encounter was consensual. They pointed to Monroe's history of being abused in male facilities, framing her as a victim of a broken system rather than a threat. This case ripped open a national wound. On one hand, transgender inmates often face horrific abuse in male prisons, a reality Monroe experienced firsthand. On the other hand, female inmates have a right to safety too. And when someone with a violent history is placed in a women's facility, the line between protection and endangerment blurs dangerously fast. The fallout? Illinois revised its inmate classification policies, moving toward individualized case reviews for transgender placements. Monroe remains incarcerated at Logan under heightened supervision, her name permanently etched into debates over prison housing policies. But what happens when the failure isn't just negligence, but also betrayal? Number 6. Marion County Jail Incident. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Nothing dramatic, no alarms, no chaos. Just a routine transfer. Or at least, that's how it was supposed to be. Between 8 and 8:30 a.m., a 28-year-old woman at Marion County Jail was mistakenly escorted into a male cell block, sharing space with 9 men. No one screamed, no immediate violence. But make no mistake, this was the kind of small error that could have turned into a tragedy in minutes. The woman was supposed to return from the jail's medical office to a female unit. Instead, she walked into the wrong dormitory-style block and immediately realized something was very, very off. 9 pairs of eyes told her everything she needed to know. Panicked, she called her mother, who called her attorney, and that's when jail officials finally noticed what their system didn't. What makes this case even more unsettling is that it wasn't the first time. Just 8 months earlier, in 2013, a similar mistake ended with a female inmate alleging she'd been sexually assaulted after being locked in a cell with a male inmate. That incident had prompted a flurry of internal action, reprimands, remedial training, and color-coded signs on cell blocks. Sheriff John Layton had promised, "Never again." But never again came again. This time, the official story was operational confusion. But underneath that, it was a mess of overcrowding, constant shuffling, and poor communication. Marion County Jail was designed for fewer inmates than it actually held. 936 people were packed inside, 264 of them women. With 71 cell blocks switching designations up to 6 times a week, sometimes several times a day, it was a logistical nightmare just waiting to spill into real danger. Lieutenant Colonel Gary Tingle, the jail division commander, acknowledged that the facility was outdated and lacked the space needed to house its current population. He explained that they were constantly shifting cell blocks simply to keep the system functioning. When asked why the error happened despite all those new signs and procedures, the answers grew foggy. No assault was reported this time, but that doesn't erase the fear or the risk. These kinds of mistakes aren't like spilled coffee. They're loaded guns that sometimes just don't go off. An internal investigation was launched. The official explanation was chronic jail overcrowding. In other words, not a single person was directly held accountable. And they were right, because what came next would not be so easily swept under the rug. Number 5. Kansas City case, Jackson County Detention Center. This one happened because someone, quite literally, forgot the keys in the door. One careless action, a guard's mistake, opened the floodgates to nearly 2 hours of terror inside the Jackson County Detention Center in Kansas City. It was the kind of night no one inside those walls would ever forget. The date was August 26, 2016. Sometime after 2:30 a.m., a corrections officer made what might be the most expensive mistake in that facility's history. They left a master key in a cell door lock. One inmate saw it. One decision later, that key wasn't just a piece of metal anymore. It was power. And that power fell into the hands of Dante Jefferson, a 29-year-old inmate already facing murder charges. With the master key in his possession, Jefferson did what the system feared most. He freed others. Surveillance footage later showed him and several men roaming freely through the women's housing unit between 2:40 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. It was a nightmare on loop. No guards intervening, no alarms blaring, just the sound of doors opening one by one. Around 4 a.m., LM, a female inmate, woke up to the unmistakable sound of a key turning in her cell door. At first, she thought it might be an officer doing rounds. But when she turned over, a stranger was already inside. Jefferson. He attacked her, choking and punching before sexually assaulting her. She heard a whistle echo from the hallway, a warning from another inmate, and Jefferson slipped back into the darkness, vanishing like he was never there. But LM wasn't the only one. Down the hall, another woman's scream broke the silence. She too was assaulted that night, held down, violated, left terrified. One of the victims later told reporters, "I woke up and he was in the bed with me. I thought he was a guard, imagine that." The very system meant to confine danger had handed it a key. When the women tried to report the assault, they were ignored. One of them said it took nearly 24 hours and a fit of yelling before anyone paid attention. And even then, medical treatment was delayed. When she was finally taken to the hospital, she was still handcuffed and wearing her jail jumpsuit. The aftermath was messy, both literally and institutionally. When investigators finally arrived, they discovered staff had already cleaned the victim's cell. Evidence gone. Her ripped clothing destroyed. Jefferson was later charged with first-degree rape, first-degree burglary, and 2 counts of sexual abuse. But here's the kicker. He was already serving 4 life sentences for a 2014 shooting that left a 34-year-old man dead and a 10-year-old boy paralyzed. For him, the consequences meant little. For the victims, the trauma was permanent. The fallout didn't stop there. Female inmates were immediately transferred out of the facility to other counties, and an independent investigation was launched. A guard was suspended. Lawsuits followed. Federal lawsuits from the victims that exposed the rot beneath the surface. In 2019, the county quietly reached settlements, including a $275,000 payout, though the full amounts were kept confidential. And yet, the systemic failures ran deeper than a single night. Reports revealed chronic understaffing, broken security protocols, and a culture that normalized small mistakes until they exploded into catastrophe. One key, one door, hours of unthinkable violence. The Jackson County Detention Center eventually overhauled its security system, transferring management to the sheriff's office. They promised better training, stricter controls, and accountability. But for those women, the apology came too late. LM's words still echo. "My life and the lives of my family have been in turmoil since that night. We are struggling to move forward." This wasn't just a security breach. It was a complete collapse of the promise that detention centers are supposed to keep. Control the danger, don't hand it the keys. If this error was careless, but accidental. Number 3, Rikers Island incident, New York. Rikers Island has never exactly been known for calm nights. But what happened in April 2022 at the Rose M. Singer Women's Jail pulled the curtain back on a messy, painful, and deeply controversial problem in America's correctional system. It began quietly. A male inmate with a history of sexual misconduct complaints managed to enter the women's facility after claiming to be transgender. Within days, the situation spiraled into what would later become one of Rikers' most contentious legal battles. The woman at the center of it all, identified in court documents as Rose Doe, first encountered her alleged attacker on April 4, 2022, when he was transferred to the protective custody unit. At first, it was groping in the bathroom, then harassment. Then, on the night of April 7th, while most of the dorm was asleep, the perpetrator allegedly pulled down Rose's pants and raped her. The guard on duty. According to the lawsuit, he was asleep in the plexiglass bubble. But here's the detail that makes this case impossible to brush aside. Rose warned the jail staff. Twice. In writing. Those complaints landed on the desk of acting warden Floyd Phipps, who even acknowledged in an email that the man was not a suitable fit for the women's unit. Yet no one moved him. No increased security, no transfer, no action. It was as if those warning signs were invisible. The lawsuit filed in November 2023 paints an even darker picture. Correction officers allegedly instructed the male inmate to claim he was transgender to gain access to the women's dorm. Transcripts from recorded jail calls reportedly show him boasting that he wasn't transgender at all. He was just there to get some sex. And if you're wondering whether this man had a clean record, the answer is a loud no. He had at least 5 open sexual misconduct complaints under the Prison Rape Elimination Act. 5. Yet somehow, he was allowed to move into a women's unit with minimal screening, almost as if the risk assessment box was checked half asleep. Rose wasn't the only one uncomfortable. Other inmates complained too. Officers Jennifer Cruz and Rashida King, both named in the lawsuit, allegedly ignored them. In fact, Cruz reportedly said, "I don't care," when they raised their concerns. That kind of response isn't just cold, it's catastrophic. It wasn't the correction officers who intervened. It was the other female inmates who physically threw the man out and packed up his belongings themselves. After the assault, things got worse. Rose says doc staff didn't rush to get her medical care. They blocked it for most of the day. Then, in what felt like punishment for speaking out, she was moved to the general population while the perpetrator was quietly transferred back to the male unit. This incident didn't just rock New York's correctional system. It poured fuel on a national debate about how prisons should handle transgender housing placements. On one side, advocates for women's safety argue that the system's current loopholes allow bad actors to exploit transgender policies for access to vulnerable populations. On the other, LGBTQ+ and prisoner rights advocates point out that transgender inmates face some of the highest rates of assault in men's facilities, and housing them according to gender identity is a life-saving policy, not a loophole. The real issue here isn't transgender identity, it's failure of the system to screen and protect properly. The Prison Rape Elimination Act requires individualized housing assessments, but in this case, those procedures were treated more like a rubber stamp than a safeguard. By late 2023, New York City faced a lawsuit from Rose Doe and 20 named individuals, including Cruz and King. It forced the Department of Correction to launch a policy review and introduce stricter risk assessment protocols, though many critics say the changes are still not enough, and unless something changes, these mistakes can happen again. The next? A guard opened the door for money. Number 4. Indiana jail incident, Clark County. On the night of October 24, 2021, the Clark County Jail in Jeffersonville, Indiana, once a backdrop for the TV show 60 Days In, became the stage for something far darker than reality TV. 28 women were about to experience what would later be described as a night of terror. It started with a key, not a master plan, not an elaborate prison break, just a key and a $1,000 deal. David Lowe, a corrections officer sworn to protect, allegedly sold access to the female pod to male inmates. That single act opened a door that should never have been opened. For the next 2 hours, chaos reigned. Male inmates stormed the women's housing unit, faces hidden behind towels and blankets like makeshift masks. What followed was every inmate's worst nightmare: assaults, harassment, threats, and panic. The women screamed, pounded the doors, hit the emergency buzzer, but help never came. Not one guard intervened. Cameras recorded it all, but no one watching seemed to care. And here's the chilling part: this wasn't some remote, forgotten facility. This was a public jail with surveillance systems, on-duty officers, and layers of supposed security. Yet no one stepped in. The locks weren't changed afterward, even though the key was missing. Meaning the women were left vulnerable, even after the assault. One of the attorneys representing the victims described their state bluntly. "When I met with these women, they broke down repeatedly. You don't need a courtroom to understand what happened. You just need to look into their eyes." But what made an already horrifying situation worse was what happened after. Instead of comfort, The women say they got punishment. Their personal belongings were confiscated. They were locked down. The lights in their cells were left on for 72 straight hours. It was like being assaulted twice, once by inmates, then by the system that was supposed to protect them. 2 federal lawsuits soon followed in 2022, naming Sheriff Jamie Knoll, David Lowe, and several other staff members. The claims were brutal and clear. The jail failed to protect its inmates. Negligence, corruption, constitutional violations. One line from the legal complaint hit like a hammer. Even though the incident involved multiple male detainees and dozens of victims over an extended period of time, not a single jail officer on duty that night came to the aid of the plaintiffs and the other victims. While the women fought in court, Knoll tried to fight in the court of public opinion. He posted surveillance footage online, trying to downplay the attack, calling the reports misrepresentations. But if anything, the footage only revealed just how badly security failed that night. By 2024, Clark County quietly settled with the 28 women for $370,500, a sum that, for many, felt like a price tag on their trauma. Meanwhile, David Lowe pleaded guilty to official misconduct in 2023. But in February 2025, the criminal charges tied to the assault were dropped. The women's attackers? Many of them faced additional time, but the betrayal they experienced came not from them, but from the man who held the key. And then there's the sheriff. Jamie Knoll, once the top lawman in the county, was later caught in a massive corruption case. In August 2024, he pleaded guilty to 27 felonies, including theft and money laundering. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. A poetic twist, maybe. But for the women of Clark County Jail, justice didn't feel like justice. This case isn't just about one guard or one night. It's about a system that cracked wide open, where corruption, negligence, and silence combined to create a perfect storm of horror. And America's problem isn't confined to its borders. Similar controversies have already echoed in Scotland, where transgender placement policies have faced intense public debate and backlash. Number 2. Scotland Incident, HMP Perth. On October 21, 2024, a woman in Scotland was mistakenly sent to an all-male prison simply because someone assumed her gender based on appearance. It started at Kirkcaldy Sheriff Court, where she appeared to be remanded in custody. The paperwork? Incomplete. The assumption? Masculine features meant male. No proper verification, no double check. And just like that, she was processed as a man and sent to HMP Perth, a maximum security male prison. The error only came to light when staff at HMP Perth conducted a more thorough search. As one insider bluntly put it, that's when they realized she was missing some vital parts you might expect a man to have. By then, it was too late to transfer her out that night. To avoid exposing her to other male inmates, prison staff kept her in segregation overnight, essentially placing her in protective isolation. She was transferred the next day to HMP Cornton Vale, Scotland's only women's prison. The whole ordeal lasted less than 24 hours. But in the world of prison intake, that's more than enough time for something to go terribly wrong. And to make matters worse, this didn't happen in a vacuum. It came on the heels of one of Scotland's biggest prison controversies, the Isla Bryson case in late 2023, where a convicted rapist who identified as a transgender woman was initially placed in a women's prison. That case ignited fierce national debate and led to new rules. Transgender inmates would be initially housed according to their biological sex-pending risk assessments. The thing is, this wasn't a transgender case. It was a cisgender woman, and the system still got it wrong. That makes it even more unsettling. If mistakes can happen even outside controversial policy debates, what else is slipping through the cracks? Police Scotland admitted to the error, promising an investigation. "We are reviewing our custody procedure to ensure this does not happen again," a spokesperson said. The Scottish Prison Service quietly initiated its own review as well, though they didn't release any major public statement. Advocacy groups like For Women Scotland didn't hold back. They called the incident a glaring example of sloppy recording and reporting of sex, a procedural failure that could have had devastating consequences if it hadn't been caught in time. In response, Scotland's prison service has since introduced enhanced gender screening protocols. Now, gender classification during intake must go through double verification before anyone is assigned to a facility. It's a good step, but many argue it's one that should have existed long before someone had to spend a night in the wrong prison. And as we've seen in other countries, not everyone gets off with just one night. Some never walk away the same. Number 1. Baltimore Case, Chelsea Gilliam. Imagine being locked in a place where your identity is questioned at the door, and everything that happens after is a consequence of that single doubt. That's what happened to Chelsea Gilliam, a transgender woman who walked into the Baltimore jail system on December 17, 2021, and came out 5 months later with scars far deeper than anyone should ever bear. Chelsea wasn't new to living as her true self. She had identified as a woman since 2003 and legally changed her name in 2009. But to the system, none of that seemed to matter. Instead of being placed in a women's facility, or at least protected according to policy, she was sent straight into an all-male dormitory at Baltimore City Correctional Center. A dorm filled with men. And just like that, a clerical choice became a nightmare. At first, it was the daily humiliations, having to shower with male inmates, being addressed by the wrong name, and denied access to her hormone treatment. But soon, it escalated. After 3 months of trying to survive in that environment, Chelsea was sexually assaulted at knife point by another prisoner. She reported it. She begged for help. But the jail took no action. No protection, no justice, just silence. Instead of being moved to safety, Chelsea was eventually transferred in February 2022 to the Maryland Reception, Diagnostic and Classification Center. But rather than support, she was thrown into solitary confinement, administrative segregation, as they called it. Shackled hand, waist, and ankles whenever she left the cell. 1 hour of freedom a day, if she was lucky. I would say I was treated like an animal, Chelsea said later. But it was worse than that. This wasn't an accident. According to her federal lawsuit, the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services violated their own housing policies by ignoring Chelsea's legal gender identity. They denied her medical care, exposed her to abuse, and isolated her because of who she was. And this wasn't an isolated story either. In 2019, another transgender woman at Baltimore City Central Booking was placed in a chokehold and slammed to the floor by a correctional officer. That attack was caught on video. Different woman, same system. In 2022, Chelsea filed a federal lawsuit accusing the DPSCS of negligence and violating the 14th Amendment and the Americans with Disabilities Act, since gender dysphoria is protected under the ADA. She isn't just suing for herself, she's suing to change the system. Since then, the court has ordered DPSCS to review and update its housing policies. Advocacy groups like the ACLU are pushing for nationwide classification standards, while federal agencies are calling for gender-sensitive prison reforms. And something is shifting. Some states have adopted double verification protocols for intake. Training for prison staff on gender identity is slowly increasing. Survivor-led activism online is forcing conversations the system once ignored. Chelsea's story has become part of a larger movement, one that's refusing to be silenced. Policy experts are proposing guard body cams, real-time intake tracking systems, and mandatory training for all correctional officers. These stories are not just statistics, they're scars, one advocate said. But cracks are forming in this wall of silence, and cracks can lead to change. What's your take on this? Share your perspective in the comments section.